Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to those listeners in Germany. I'm Nevin Gussack. I'm the host of the Politically Homeless podcast, and with me is the podcaster and author Alex Benesch from all the way over in the German Federal Republic. How you doing, Alex?
I'm doing fine. How's it going? I was preparing my notes for today's show, and I have this comparison I think people should be aware of. When we talk about the Russians and what they view as legitimacy for a country. I mean, of course, everybody's by now seen the interview with Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, and for the first 30 minutes, Putin is explaining what makes a country legit to him and what makes a country not legit. So he says that his beloved Russian Empire is over 1,000 years old, and that makes it legit. Now, never mind the fact that for 999 years, the Russian system was a system of serfdom. So they hadn't really progressed in 999 years. He talks about the 1,000-year anniversary, but just the year before that anniversary, they still had serfdom. So nothing progressed. The will of the people counted for nothing. This is sort of the thing when you have Ukrainians today. Ukrainians actually want to be Ukrainians. They don't want to be Russians. And in today's world, we respect the will of the people. They want to be Ukrainians. And they also want a free system. They want liberty, which also means legitimacy in our day and age. So Tucker Carlson should have understood this, him being an American, because the United States came out of a revolution. And before the revolution, it was just 13 British colonies, and the king was King George III. But enough Americans said, we don't want to be British subjects, we want to be Americans, and we also want to be a full republic, we want to have liberty. So according to these rebels, that gave them legitimacy. They had the will of the people, they had the intention of having liberty in a republic. And today we understand this actually gave them legitimacy, but not to Putin. According to Putin, basically, Americans would have to burn their American flags, burn their American passports, and pledge allegiance to King Charles of Great Britain today. So this was kind of the ideological clash voiced in this interview. Now, Tucker Carlson wasn't really saying much, and he really didn't understand what Putin was talking about for 30 minutes. And to me, it was obvious. Putin is saying what makes a country legit, and Putin is also saying what makes a war legit. Of course, these opinions also clash with any modern understanding. And I have another comparison for people to understand what happened with Russia after 1991. Okay. So imagine this. Imagine if World War II had gone a different way. The war was back and forth, and the Nazis finally settled with the other powers. So the Nazis give back certain territories. They give back Ukraine. They give back Poland. Well, let's say parts of Poland, but they keep Austria. They keep some other territories, and they keep parts of France too. So this is sort of the deal. The fighting ends, and the new German government says that National Socialism is over and it's never coming back. We have a new leadership. And we have a new ideological structure. So you get aristocrats. So aristocrats now have positions. We've got the generals. We've got some sort of a parliamentary system. We call ourselves a republic, and we have a strong church again, and all that. So it's a bit of everything. Imagine if that had been the new sales pitch of the German post-war government, right? I mean, it sounds nice, right? They have a bit of everything. They have a bit of democracy, bit of republic, bit of military leadership, aristocratic leadership. They have this new church and everything, and they say National Socialism is over. But then you notice that this new Germany is not really changing that much because while Hitler is gone, he's on his mountain or he's dead because he was so old and frail. But this new Germany was dominated by intelligence officers from the Abwehr, the SD, which was tied to the SS, and some other intelligence agencies. And you start to notice that the intelligence services of Germany are running everything. And they're also running these corporations. So suddenly you have big corporations like Siemens or Volkswagen. They're selling their stuff worldwide. German money is flowing into international banks. German money ends up in the city of London. And people starting to get worried. Maybe the Germans have become smarter. They have a smarter imperialism. They try to use intelligence agencies and they're trying to use the economy to gain power, and they may actually attempt to take over Europe again, but in a more elegant fashion, have some sort of a Nazi European Union. I mean, wouldn't that concern people? Would people actually trust this new post-war Germany? And anybody who has his head screwed on right would not trust this post-war Germany. But this actually was the plan of some high-ranking Germans in the 1940s who understood that the war could not be won decisively. They had in mind sort of a post-war order where they get rid of Hitler and then act real nice. But they would have still been very, very dangerous. This was kind of a significant plan of some people in the 1940s. And that plan is essentially what the Russians had done after 1991. So instead of having Volkswagen and Siemens be used for imperialism, they used Gazprom and Rosneft and all these companies. And of course, in Russia, the intelligence services, they run everything. So what other option was there for Russian imperialism, or let's say for German imperialism, in case the war could have been ended by a peace deal? So it's not like they had many different options. They used the one option that was kind of obvious. The Russians, they used the option that was kind of obvious. And some of these German guys in the 1940s, they also had this one option in mind. We'll just play nice. We'll get rid of Hitler. We'll claim National Socialism is over. This is essentially what the Russians had come up with. It's the most obvious choice, but it seems like many people fell for it.
It's a perfect example. No, this is an excellent example that you provide about this. And really, I would argue it started even before 1991. And clearly there was a plan that was, this was outlined in great detail in works like Putin's People, which talks about how, as far back as at least the late 1970s, the Soviets were opening up even more front companies, businesses, ostensibly private businesses and joint ventures in the Soviet Union to help save and revitalize the Soviet economy. And the Soviet Union has tried this before, of course, under Lenin's new economic policy and Operation Trust, to make the Soviet Union look like it's about to collapse, that communism was not lasting, that we can do business with the Soviet Union. It was becoming more kinder and gentler and more oriented towards a free market economy. But the reality is different. What did Gorbachev, of course, fast forward to Gorbachev's dictatorship, what happened? Well, he wanted to eliminate the image of the enemy. And there was a speech that Gorbachev gave to assembled leaders in July 1988 to the leaders of the Warsaw Pact. And this was the plan in a nutshell. And he was successful. Russia was successful. So Gorbachev said, and this is on the website of Princeton University's Cold War International History Project. And Gorbachev said in July 1988 in a secret speech, "A new image of socialism prevents the traditionally right-wing circles in the West to continue dominating the world, as they did by using a stereotyped image of the enemy, the communist totalitarian monster. This tendency is strengthened by the revival of the anti military movement in the West. So, what is Gorbachev saying? He's saying what he said before, and his various political allies, like Georgy Arbatov. Let's eliminate the image of the enemy of the Soviet Union. That allows Western militarism to lower its guard and to collapse the quote unquote military industrial complex and allow us to cut spending in our weapons programs. And lo and behold, by the end of the late 1980s, early 1990s, you had neoconservatives like Francis Fukuyama claiming we're at the end of history. You have Grover Norquist of Americans for Tax Reform by the late 1990s, a big fixture in the conservative movement, a labor hater and a libertarian, saying that, oh, China and Russia and the Islamic world, they don't pose a threat to the United States. We can trade with them. He actually wrote that, I believe, in an issue of the American Enterprise magazine. So on it goes. And here we willfully choose not to pay attention to these things. But the warnings have been there, Alex. You know that. The warnings have been in Germany to a lesser degree, too, that Russia continues to modernize its strategic arsenal, that they continue to embark on weapons modernization programs, often with help from Western corporations and banks, including ones here in America. And now we see that Russia is, I mean, what more? Here's a little tidbit. You have American communists that are going in a matter of a month or two to the World Youth Festival, which once again is being held in Russia. That's an old communist, international communist front operation that started in the late 1940s, and an old Stalinist communist operation. And now they're holding the World Youth Festival again, just like in 2017, again in Russia, where you have even American communists, as well as communists and leftists from all over the world, celebrating in this huge jamboree, this whole paean to communism. And this is an operation that is exclusively supported by Putin. We have Russia and Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. You have an alliance with the ANC-dominated government in South Africa. You have, Russia aligned with Belarus, which is governed under a dictatorship of Alexander Lukashenko, who's openly a communist. You have the Russians backing North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, the list goes on and on and on. And the Russians have had ties with even American extremists, as well as extremists from all over the world.
Yeah, because they can mimic everything. This is sort of this crazy ability by Russia nowadays to mimic almost everything. So they can mimic conservatism, right? They can mimic the political center almost, because, over in Germany, for example, for a long time, people believed Russia is becoming a normal country. It's sort of like, it's not left, it's not right, it's something, in between that. They can mimic normal, political center, but they can also still ensnare leftists worldwide. And also, of course, there's people in the West that they have low-paying jobs, people that grew up poor, or they've just had a difficult life. But still, a lot of these Westerners, they will not adapt communism. So this is when traditional conspiracy ideology comes in, something that has been cultivated, that was cultivated heavily by the Russians as well. Because if you want to get people, if you want to make people as angry as possible, you want, as I say, Americans to turn against their own government and their own institutions. Sometimes you can get people to become communists, but if that doesn't work, you can still turn them into truthers. You can still turn them into conspiracy activists. And if you look at, let's say, the traditional material by the John Birch Society, it almost exclusively consists of just complains about specific corporations. It's just like corporations that are members of the Trilateral Commission or the Council on Foreign Relations. So it's just this constant stream of this corporation is bad, that corporation is bad, they're all bad. It's not too different from Lenin's major text on imperialism and capitalism. So because Lenin's stuff was 90% just complaints about the big Western corporations and the trusts. So they're sort of, playing the same card here. And I noticed when the Tucker interview happened, or right after the Tucker interview happened with Putin, the truthers were cheering for it. They were calling this a major success. And then you saw Alex Jones, for example, from Texas. You saw Alex Jones publishing stuff about it, and I got some quotes here, and this is fairly recent. This is maybe a week ago, or not, almost a week ago. Jones said the following. He says, "The globalists," and I'll explain what he means by that. He says the globalists and corporations have conquered America and Europe. So America and Europe are not free countries. The systems, they have to be overthrown to get liberty, and so these occupiers, he says, they are guilty of everything that's going wrong. So anything, the debt and the migration, that's all the fault of these occupiers. And then he says the Soviet Union for 85 years had been occupied by the exact same globalist forces. Now, what does that mean? And he explains what he means by that. And he says that and he says that Russia ultimately escaped from this globalist conspiracy. Right? So 85 years they've been under that control, the globalists, and then suddenly Russia is free. Therefore, according to Alex Jones' logic, Americans have to get Russian help to free America from this occupation. And then he gets into detail, and this is where he basically tells you where this is all coming from. He talks about the Russian Communist Revolution back in the day, and he says that, the following happened. It was the Rothschild family, so this tiny little Jewish banking family, which basically just worked for the British Crown to do these tasks. But he believes the tiny Rothschild family and some other tiny Jewish families, they took over control over the British Empire. And so then the British Empire mobilizes all these mainly Jewish communists to take over Russia and create the Soviet Union. This is the occupation, according to Alex Jones, that lasted 85 years. And so he says that various countries, they were trying to get involved in Russia, but ultimately British intelligence, controlled by these Jews, they made communism happen. And then Alex Jones says Ukraine was never really a country, and then Lenin actually declared Ukraine to be a country, sort of as a payback for all the help in getting the Soviet Union off the ground. And Alex Jones specifically mentions this was payment for the West, specifically for the Rothschilds. So basically what he's saying is that this was that handing over Ukraine temporarily by Lenin, this was sort of a Judas-like payback, so to say.
Yep.
So
Yeah, and oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I mean, so basically, Alex Jones is still following the old John Birch Society uh, interpretation of history. Now, the Birch Society they distanced themselves from the fake protocols of Zion, but they still kept the Rothschild legends. And of course, the John Birch Society they got this stuff from even older conspiracy literature. So Alex Jones is going off of fake material that is up to 200 years old because this started in the early 1800s. And so, according to Jones, the Jews took over Britain and then they made Russia communist for 85 years. But magically, Russia was able, and probably means Putin was able to Putin was able to liberate Russia from the Jewish conspiracy. And now we need Putin's help to rid America and Europe of the same Jewish conspiracy. I mean, this is what I get out of Alex's words and also his background, because we know he was a Bircher. I mean, if you confront him with that, he would probably try to talk his way out of it and say, that's not what I meant, blah, blah, blah. But that's what it sounds like. I mean, he's saying, Lenin gave the Ukraine away as payback to the Rothschilds because the Rothschilds used British intelligence to make Russia communist. I mean, am I missing something here? Am I imagining things?
No, I mean, there's a lot to unpack. I thought you had paused earlier, so I thought that was an opening for me to talk. So my apologies, but putting that as moving beyond that, there's a lot to unpack here. I was a Bircher at one time.
I think
and
everybody was.
while
I mean, at some point, almost anybody came into contact with it's some form of contact with that material. I mean, this is
and there's a lot that I learned from the Birchers. I learned on the historical fact that I never learned even in the university. I was a history major and political science major, double major, and I did not know until I joined the Birch Society that Western companies and banks traded with the Soviet Union and other anti-capitalist revolutionary states like National Socialist Germany and Fascist Italy, etc. Where I disagree with the Birch Society on certain issues, especially with my political formation today or my political worldview today. I don't subscribe to the conspiracy view because I think that's the way these corporations operate. That's a function of capitalism, especially when it overpowers the state, which is trying to protect its national security. And I think that's a better way of explaining that kind of behavior. And when you look at, for example, the tell-all article that was written in the New York Times by Sam Polk, who was a former hedge fund executive on Wall Street, and he talked about how he and his colleagues could dominate governments and get mayor of New York eating out of their hands, and that they were, quote, fireballs of greed, and that they didn't have the brain capacity to consider the interests of American workers or American national security in their business decisions. I think that's a better explanation of really how capitalism or aspects of capitalism operates in the real world, whereas conspiracy theories openly really does not address the pitfalls of capitalism left unmoored. That's my one problem. The next problem is you're right. Their older John Birch literature from the 60s, if you look very carefully, they do have mention, depending on the writer, of the Rothschilds. There have been Birchers that have moved on from the hyper-individualism of Birch ideology to National Socialism, which is hyper-collectivistic and arguably a form of socialism, as I view it, a very heterodox view of socialism. People like Tom Metzger, Revelo Oliver. Revelo Oliver, I believe, was on the National Council in the John Birch Society, and he later had essays that were praising the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, the fanaticism of their, yes, I kid you not, of their Revolutionary Guard Corps, yes. Now, another thing about the Birch Society is very interesting. I'm an anti-fascist. I'm against fascism for many, many different reasons, obviously, but I'm sure you're aware, one of the things I noticed is that, and I spoke to the Birch chapter leaders, and none of them were racist, None of them were anti-Jewish. They, by nature, were very good people. Other people that you and I know have had some pretty bad experiences with the Birch Society, where they bumped up against on one or two of the highest level leaders anti-Semitic prejudice or anti-Jewish prejudice. Now, the Birch Society praised leaders like Rafael Trujillo, Anastasio Somoza, apartheid in South Africa, etc. Now, what was problematic about that is that they would view Western Europe or institutions or programs like the New Deal, which I argue saved capitalism. They argue that was communism or socialism, but yet they viewed Anastasio Somoza in
Mm.
Nicaragua or as a paragon of free enterprise, even though when you look at the rhetoric and the actions of Anastasio Somoza, now he was a lot better than the Sandinistas, and that's not saying much, but in reality, he was a sort of populist corporatist leader that believed in an authoritarian enforced class collaboration. There was state ownership of enterprises, and the state had a lot of influence in the private enterprises. In fact, Somoza referred to himself in an interview back in 1974 as I mix socialism and free
Hmm.
enterprise, and I would, and stuff like that. So I'm looking at the Birchers and Trujillo. I just interlibrary loaned a book by Trujillo's government from 1960 called Basic Policies of a Regime, where they're damning the same individualistic liberalism, a classical economic liberalism, and using these sort of leftish sounding talking points against the liberal economy. And I'm very critical of classical liberal aspects of classical economic and political liberalism. But here they're using this rhetoric, and Trujillo and his cohorts are using this rhetoric, having tremendous state control of the economy. But yet, because he's anti
Yeah.
communist and Christian, the Birchers like him. And, the argument I got when I confronted the chapter leader about this, I had a discussion. It's like, yeah, you're right, but in reality, the fact of the matter is that we have to support these leaders against the communists. And I look at things as a historian, just like you, Alex, and our friend J.R. Nyquist, and other of our colleagues and friends. The history is the history. Here you're damning social democrats, right wing social democrats, not fake social democrats like Egon Barr and
Yeah.
others in the old West Germany. They were fake West social democrats. They were communists. I'm talking about social democracy as expounded in the Gerdsberg program, which we talked about earlier from 1959, which stabilized capitalism. Birchers say, "Oh, that's communism, that's socialism," but yet leaders, these different authoritarian and fascistic dictators all over the world during the Cold War, all of a sudden, they
Hmm.
love Francisco Franco. I
Yeah.
mean, who said he hates capitalism and had massive state-owned enterprises like
Yeah.
I
I
and
think that.
other state holding companies. And this is what the Birchers like. So I kind of left them. Now with Jones, I mean, it's not unusual. Jones is an interesting case. He was a staunch critic of Putin and Yeltsin. He talked about back in the
Yeah.
1990s and early 2000s how Russia and China were still communists, they were a threat.
Hmm.
And then he made a turnaround mysteriously in Georgia. And here's a little tidbit: when you look in
2000. That
court
was
testimony,
2008. Just for people who don't remember, the Georgia invasion or the Georgia conflict, that was in 2008 when the Bush administration ended, and that also marked the changes in Alex Jones's view on Russia. And this was also a bigger push by the Russians starting in 2008.
yeah. So, in fact, here's a little interesting tidbit. Jones met with one Russian operative. According to the testimony of Robin Drew, a former news director at InfoWars, Alex Jones met with what she claimed was Daria, the Russian operative in the office. So there's a lot of, as an intelligence analyst yourself, that should be a very interesting tidbit. And there are elements within Jones' following and even in his employ that have called for literally the defeat of the United States. You look at Owen Schroyer, for example, who works with Jones, who's a host on Jones's show,
Who
who
is
has
soft on
talked about
China now?
how,
Yeah, Schroeder
yeah,
is soft
well,
on
he
China now.
calls, Well, it's worse. He views Russia and China and Saudi Arabia and India as rising powers, and they should displace the United States. That the United States is a rotten, putrid corpse, basically. And he also talks about how gleefully that how Russia and China are going to grab, quote, the world's means of production,
Hmm.
which is a
A
Marxist
Marxist
term.
term.
So, Jones and a portion of this right element of the right that MAGA unfortunately is in thrall of really laps this stuff up. And I can give you and the audience many other instances. You have a former Breitbart writer, Lee Stranahan, who now is on Russian media, who brags happily that, hey, I'm happy to be paid by the Russians, and he basically doesn't care. He says that he doesn't have any qualms with being, quote, on the Russian payroll. And guess what? Lee Stranahan has moved now and basically collaborates with the communists of the Center for Political Innovation, which is led by Caleb Maupin, formerly of the Workers' World Party. So you have this radicalization. Now let's get into Tucker. Tucker, you look at the Putin interview, and what I got from the Putin interview with Tucker, or I should say, the Tucker's interview with Putin, was essentially that Putin was using that as a tool to drive wedges in American and Western politics. He was bashing Ukraine as a creation of Lenin's Bolsheviks, and I believe that was calculated to appeal to
Yeah.
the MAGA anti-communists to delegitimize Ukraine further. Then he was doing wink winks to the Marxist Leninists in the West, including the United States, by mentioning, and Jaron Nyquist is good in bringing this up, probably one of the few that has brought it up, where Putin talks about the forces of history. That's definitely a very much a Leninist standard communist
Yeah, and also
terminology that's used.
Putin was praising China in this interview as an economic juggernaut. In China, he said China was overtaking the United States and blah blah blah. So this is also a Marxist-Leninist interpretation by saying America is dying. America is in decline. So this is kind of like the end stage capitalism morphing into wild warfare, imperialism. So this is appealing to the left. And Tucker, I think Tucker was fishing for certain statements that Putin was not willing to make. So Tucker was basically asking for a negative comment from Putin about the Democrats, but Putin wouldn't say anything like that. And now Putin even says he prefers Joe Biden over Donald Trump. And the other thing I noticed was that Tucker asked him, what do you think are the secret centers of power in the United States, where all the big decisions are made, and Putin dodged the question. So this is for, if the truthers think that Putin is their friend, he's really not. And if the conservatives think he's their friend, he's really not. He's playing all sides. He's playing everybody. And I think that, when you mentioned yourself getting into the Bircher material, I mean, some of the books that came out of the Birch Society were quite detailed and substantial, but the mega bestsellers, as you mentioned, from the 60s, like Gary Allen's stuff, if you look at Gary Allen and if you look at Cleon Skousen, they do have, and this is, I think, the biggest flaw, they have these Rothschild fairy tales about the Rothschilds not just taking over in all these places, but also the Rothschilds supposedly got all these European powers to fight each other. When in reality, this had been going on for many hundreds of years. The Europeans were always fighting each other and making different alliances and shifting alliances. The Rothschild or any modern banking didn't change anything about that. But according to some of this old literature that Alex Jones has read, according to this old literature, you can all pin it on this Jewish influence, when absolutely no conspiracy literature, and I've looked at 200 years worth of of conspiracy literature, nowhere at any point, nowhere does any author identify a single new trick or technique invented by Jewish people. I mean, supposedly the Rothschilds took over the world or half of the world with nothing but a courier system and loans, which anybody could do. So it's just this idea that, and this is absolutely key, this idea that before the 20th century, supposedly nobody had significant large intelligence capabilities except for Jewish people, which is utter nonsense. And I think you have to blame mostly regular historians who are not trained in intelligence, because they tell all the stuff about the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s. They tell they tell you all this history without really reconstructing the intelligence networks, because we don't have all this data and files to go through from those areas. But you can rest assured that the big empires of the past also had very large intelligence networks and capabilities. But if you're completely unaware of the intelligence capabilities of the British and the Germans and the Austrians and the French and the Russians under the Tsars, if you don't know about any of that, if you don't reconstruct that, then of course, if you don't know any of this, you may still be interested in secrets of the past. And this is, of course, where the traditional conspiracy media comes in and says, oh, we know about the old secrets and old networks, and it's the Jews, as if some tiny Jewish families who worked for the crown, as if they could make all the decisions, as if they had invented modern intelligence techniques. It's absolute nonsense, and it's easy for the Russians to latch onto that and tell the Americans, your country is occupied, we'll help you to get it back, or we'll just help you destroy it, and who knows what comes afterwards. This is
well, yeah.
And also,
you have more and more. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and also just before I forget that one specific point, because the average historians, they tell you quite a bit about the American Gilded Age, like in the late 1800s, when the big steel corporations formed, and the railway corporations, and the oil corporations, and then of course the car companies formed. They treat this like it was just about individual greed, but if you look at this from a distance, of course it was about securing the United States and creating these industries to be safe in the future. So there must have been some sort of clandestine organization and coordination on a baseline level, just to make sure these companies wouldn't betray American interests, or just to make sure that this all works out for America. So you have this modern production. So there was some clandestine stuff going on, but it's not just a greedy conspiracy, as Lenin said, or a greedy conspiracy as, let's say, the Birchers claimed, or some other conspiracy guys claimed. So I think some of these robber barons were placeholders. I think that some of these corporations, they were built by money, networks, and the scientists, because if you have the scientists and all the other stuff, you can make a company. So I don't believe a guy like Astor could come to the United States flat broke and then become the richest guy ever. I don't think that it happened that way. But we have to reconstruct sort of the secret history of capitalism, so we have a better understanding how to fix capitalism, because it sort of turned into a modern day serfdom to a certain degree. And I think that some powerful people in America, they didn't really believe in a republic. They didn't really believe in free markets. They rather would copy the old British Empire and create front companies and control people that way. So I think we have to reconstruct the past better than the Birch Society did, or some other conspiracy guys did, and of course better than the communists and Lenin did.
Yeah, I mean, with the Birch literature, well, first of all, one thing about the Birchers is weird, even though they were against National Socialism and fascism and racism, at least officially, yet they published the works of a former Iron Guard foreign minister, Prince Mihai Sturza, under the pseudonym Zad Rust. They published about two or three books of his. So one has to wonder about them, really, why and what. The conspiracy literature, the Russians, even during the Cold War, they used these conspiracy themes in their own propaganda and have supported extremists throughout the world that have utilized and spoke about these conspiracy themes, protocols of elders of Zion. We know from the testimony of former Romanian intelligence official or leader, chief, DIE chief, Ion Pachepa, talked about how the Soviets used the old czarist anti-Jewish conspiracy theories to gain further influence in the Middle East.
Oh yeah.
Forget Andropov, the former head of the KGB, said he would basically stir up all kinds of prejudices like a petri dish full of bacteria and viruses in the Middle East, and that has been successful. I mean, that's always been ever present in the Middle East for much of the 20th century and even before, and even to this day. So yeah, the Soviets and now the Russians, they use these conspiracy themes clearly to collapse the United States. There's definitely nothing new with that. It's an effective strategy. They've used it during the Cold War to use the pacifist and anti-war themes to basically force us to withdraw from the Vietnam War, whatever your position is on that conflict. Um, Now, concerning, getting back to your point on conspiracy theory, literature, and capitalism, the Birchers, if I recall correctly, when they address the Rockefellers, that's another
Yeah.
target of the Birchers, and the Rothschilds, they generally they don't really go into the motivations other than that these individuals are ideologically globalists, they're monopoly capitalists. They don't really go into a real examination of capitalism. And let us understand, just like there are many flavors of socialism, there are many flavors of capitalism, some good and some bad. The Birchers really don't go into that. And also, their solutions tend to be more constitution, more limited government, more laissez faire.
Mm-hmm.
So, from my position, I'm a radical civic nationalist. I'm neither right nor left by the contemporary American political standards. The way to my position is the way you achieve a sort of balance of power in competing factions in society is you have a strong central state when needed to push back. That's like, for example, when it comes to class forces in society or economic interests. I don't like a society where the labor unions are too powerful and overpowering the capitalists in every turn. But I also don't like how, and don't think it's favorable for capitalism and free society, where you have financialized, hyper financialized version of capitalism overpowering basically the 99% of American society either. So I like to achieve a sort of balance of forces as much as possible, which did to a degree exist in the United States. So the Birchers really don't talk about that. I looked at that because I look at actually what the capitalists say, what they do. There are many good capitalists out there too, as well, including ones in my family. So I also have to provide this caveat too, that there are many good capitalists that are very patriotic, that are really do create great products and great services. The capitalism that I'm very critical of, and the Birchers really do never go into this too much, is the financialized capitalism. For example, private equity, leverage buyouts, whatnot. Those are not necessarily selling new products and services. They're extracting money to
It's just
create
using
more money.
force. It's just using force to gain more force to gain more force, and
Exactly.
firing
And I
power.
feel that needs Exactly, and I feel that needs to be banned. And things like stock buybacks used to be banned in this country until Reagan legalized that. So when we're talking about capitalism, it's not just about, oh, so and so creates a new product and services and we should be thankful. It's a very simplistic explanation. There are many different flavors and types of capitalism. And the Birchers never go into that. So I
Mm.
really could never square over the years since when I moved down to Florida from New York. I'm from the state of New York originally, and I was a Bircher for a few years off and on when I was in college. They never really went into that. And when you really dive into the research material, you start to really have different opinions and you have a different perspective on things. Now, now one
Well,
more thing on. Go ahead. Go ahead.
well, it's sort of like people are unaware of or seem to be unaware of in very baseline intelligence dynamics when it comes to corporations and the system per se. For example, this is sort of the classic argument that you hear a lot. People will say the Jewish world conspiracy must be true because look at this bank, it's majority owned by a Jewish person. Or let's say the Federal Reserve central bank system must be a part of the Jewish conspiracy because it has or has had some Jewish directors. But it's just if somebody gets hired for performing these boring tasks of running a central bank, that does not mean any more than that. And same goes when you talk about, let's say, ownership on paper. And also, if somebody is presented as the owner, majority owner, or somebody owns the most shares of a company, that may be true, if we take it at face value. But if you look deeper, it can be more complicated because, what does an intelligence service do every day? They create front organizations and front companies. So this is sort of a thing that the British Empire perfected, and what I think some Americans have copied fairly well. The offshore system with the City of London, which was not taken over by the Rothschilds, by the way, after the Battle of Waterloo. That's another fairy tale. But it's sort of this system that has many different elements, and it's very secretive, and it's very family based by these high-ranking aristocrats. Call them Anglos, but they're very German actually. And so the British perfected this method. So somebody would claim to be the owner of something, but they had secret contracts. All you need is a safe with some hidden contracts where this one guy that plays the owner, where this guy signs these papers transferring controlling power to some other entity that he may not even really know or understand, right? This is what the mafia does. This is what every mafia group does. So, for example, in Germany, we have different mafia groups, obviously, and you can see these people, these mafia members, driving around in a sports car, let's say an Italian sports car that costs $300,000. Officially, they are listed as jobless. They are on social security benefits, and if the police stops them in traffic, they will say, well, this car is owned by a company that is owned by another company, which is owned by some shareholders in some other country. And, this car is owned by some other entity. I just get to drive it. And so he shows his papers, and the cops can't do anything, right? Because this is how a mafia system is built. But the moment this one guy loses the trust of the group, he's completely on his own. He doesn't own the car. He doesn't own his apartment. He doesn't own his bank accounts. He doesn't control anything. And so I think that when you look at these arguments, well, this guy controls this company, it's way more complicated than that. If people look at, let's say, the British East India Company, people have to wonder, was this a private corporation or was this government? It was both, actually. So if you had investment money, you could be part of that. you could go to these foreign lands and you could bring your own soldiers. You could actually wage war. And if this all worked out, you had continuous government backing. But if it didn't work out, if you messed up, you could lose your investment. So is this capitalism? Surely not. I mean, this is sort of like a modern day Viking exploration to steal things, right? So we have to be aware of, I think, older intelligence networks. And this is something that I started to look into a couple of years ago, because I was not content with the mainline historian version of history. I was not happy with the conspiracy version of history. I was not happy with the communist version of history. And so large empires had large intelligence agencies, but they didn't have paper records accessed by, parliamentarians like we have in modern times. So if this was family-based intelligence, you cannot expect to get declassified records of what happened. But if you understand modern intelligence agencies and how they work, then you look at history again, and then you can sort of piece together as good as you can how the modern world was built. And I think that especially in America, some powerful people, they didn't really believe in the republic. They didn't really believe in liberty, but they try to continue sort of a copied version of what the British had come up with. And I think this is sort of the dangerous strain in America today. It's not a Jewish conspiracy. Jews didn't invent, greed. Jews didn't invent intelligence techniques. Jews didn't invent, ancient mystery cults. None of that. But it's more like a German-British strain of serfdom, really, aristocratic rule and serfdom. And so it's kind of ironic if that strain became powerful in America, and then it was the counter movement sort of became communism. But in the modern world, if you're a citizen in a communist system today, it feels just like ancient serfdom, or let's say a modernized version of serfdom, right? I mean, you could call yourself a communist citizen, or you could call yourself a modern serf. Your everyday life can be almost the same. And I think that makes these two very dangerous strains eerily compatible. And so I think that this is what people need to be aware of when they talk about, let's say, the craziness in large-scale American capitalism, the offshore and the exploitation of the workers. So I think that by reconstructing the secret history of capitalism, I think this is how we can actually fix capitalism, or finally try real capitalism that is not under the control of some mega players. Because if you start a company and you're successful and you make some new cool thing, you can be bought out, or you can be regulated to a point where you have to sell, or somebody steals your secrets, right? Or somebody just uses more financial force to push you out of the market, and they copy what you do, right? So, but I think this all goes over the heads of, let's say, an Alex Jones or a Tucker Carlson. I mean, we know that Tucker spent his college days drunk. He was not allowed to enter the CIA. And Alex Jones never became a professional expert. He never did. And he didn't even hire experts. I mean, he had enough money at some point to hire experts to do that work for him, but he chose to hire these young kids fresh out of college, or almost fresh out of college, like Owen Schroyer. I think Owen Schroyer was a sports broadcaster. And so Jones paid him like $100,000 a year, and he puts him in front of a microphone and a camera in front of 3 million or something listeners. And that went horribly wrong with the Sandy Hook thing. That became sort of a big problem. But that's just one aspect of the many symptoms of just incompetence. Right? But these people think they understand it. These people think they understand the secret history, and they know how to fix America fix America today. So how easy is it for Russians nowadays to recruit these Americans, these patriots, these truthers? I mean, it must be like, hey, you want to work for us? Of course I want to work for you. It's just that simple.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this is where, I mean, I cited examples of Lee Stranahan, Nick Fuentes, and others. Nick Fuentes has openly said that he hopes for a victory of China and Russia over the United States. And he has a large following in social media and in real life. He's the head of so called America First. And I will say, how can you be America First and make America great again when you're cheerleading for Russia and even China or both of them? That's America very last. Concerning the whole Jewish conspiracy, I mean, I'm Jewish. I have no access to the kind of money that quote unquote elements of the Jewish banking and business communities have. I don't have any pull, or there's no ethnic loyalty between me and the big Jewish investors. I'm just viewed as another widget or consumer or product to be utilized to further their quest to make a profit. That's essentially what I am. There's no ethnic loyalty, and this is where the Jewish conspiracy people, in my opinion, get it wrong. They think there's this sense of ethnic solidarity, and that's not always. A lot of time, many times, it's not the truth. You look at how many Israeli companies, for example, conduct deals underground with Iran, with
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein's Iraq, with Gaddafi's Libya. And this is brought up even in the European as well as the Israeli press. And they don't like to talk about that. They've admitted that. There are Israeli government leaders and business community. They are embarrassed to talk about that. In some of the Israeli technology that was military technology and weapon systems that were sold by the communist Chinese were incorporated in Chinese weapon systems. Then there were sold back to anti-Zionist states like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Saddam Hussein's Iraq in weapon systems, Chinese weapon systems sold to those anti-Israel, anti-Jewish countries. So, and there's many more proof of this where Israeli branches of the Bank of China in Israel were found to, you probably heard about this, Alex, to have provided Hamas with money to finance terror attacks against American and Israeli Jews within Israel.
Mm.
And the Netanyahu government at the time quashed any real inquiries into that, into really cracking down on those branches of the Bank of China. And that was a kind of a scandal back then. So this notion that Jews are like bound by this sense of national solidarity, it's not true. And finally, when you look at the end product of individuals that are often fascist or national socialists that believe in this, quote, Jewish world conspiracy, well, when they take power, they usher in the most horrible human rights violators, hyper-militaristic, political and economic regimentation, and, might I add, subvert and try to conquer America. So it's like, again, you look at these individuals and these organizations, and even if they contain grains of truth in their points, you really don't want to legitimize them because the body count is there.
Yeah.
We all know what's going on.
And also, if many truthers, for example, they really do not understand European history because that's just way too old for them, or this is not relevant to them. But the reality was that Jewish people were oftentimes forced to cooperate with the aristocracies, and they were used for various purposes. Sometimes it was, to facilitate foreign trade by the aristocrats, and sometimes it was espionage. Now, imagine if you live in a close community, if you are under total control of the aristocracy, and they offer you a deal that you, quote unquote, cannot refuse. So they go to an individual and say, we want you and your family for multiple generations in the future. We want you to spy for us. And if you do this, not only will you be rewarded, but your community will be rewarded, with more freedoms and not get burned to death or something. But if you refuse, your entire community will suffer. And this went on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And this is also where some of this mythology actually comes from. You know, when you have a few Jewish people in Europe involved in espionage, this was run by the aristocracy. And also, when we talk about the Russians and Israel, almost nobody was allowed to leave the USSR, the Soviet Union, but Jewish people were allowed to leave because the Soviets wanted to infiltrate the new state of Israel. And so not only did you get your average, recruited asset, and by recruitment I mean spy for us, or your whole community will suffer, because the Russians, even under communism, they played the same old game. But also there is documentation on just straight up Russian, Slavic, straight up Russian intelligence assets assuming a Jewish identity by stealing the identities of Jewish children from cemeteries, children that had died at a young age. They would take these names, create these fake passports, fake history, fake legend. And sometimes these intelligence assets of the KGB, they would simply buy documents. Or create documents. They would create a whole fake backstory and turn a Slavic Russian KGB person, turn that person into a fake Jew, and then send him to Israel. And so this is why people have to be careful when they talk about these so-called Jewish Russian oligarchs or Israeli, powerful Israeli people with a sort of a Russian background. You can never be quite sure what that person actually is, and so you hear this story about these Russian oligarchs in the 1990s. Some of them were then put in prison by the Putin regime. And so initially, these people were created as fake oligarchs run by the intelligence assets. But these fake oligarchs, they started to do their own thing, and they were taken out of the game. But of course, the Russian propaganda interpreted this in public in a different way. And this is kind of what Alex Jones was referring to by claiming, 85 years of 85 years of communism because of the Jews, and then Russia liberated itself from this conspiracy. So this goes back to this nonsense about Putin removing these so-called Jewish oligarchs, right? This became the legend. This became the legend of Putin basically defying the elders of Zion, and now the elders of Zion are very angry. That's why the elders of Zion used Ukraine to threaten Mother Russia, and that's why Putin had to invade.
Well, who also said the same about Stalin? There were the pro-Soviet faction of the German National Socialist Workers' Party said the same thing. The Gregor and Otto Strasser, Joseph Goebbels, even Hitler and Alfred Rosenberg even said that about Stalin, that Stalin ejected the Jewish element in Bolshevism and created this unique form of Russian National Socialism. So, even American anti-Semites, including, I think it was former U.S. Senator from Mississippi, it might have been, I think it was Theodore Bilbo or John Rankin, Congressman John Rankin, said the same thing too. So it's the same pattern. I'm detecting with the way you're saying, which I'm familiar with. It's the same pattern. David Duke said the same thing about Putin back in 2012. I'll call him David Puke. He said in 2012 that Putin basically ejected the Jewish New World Order from Russia, said the same thing. So it's, and the Russians and their allies during the Cold War and afterwards, they continue to use this. You look at Russia now. Russia has had ties with elements of the German neo-Nazi movement, like the
Yeah.
NPD, the National Democratic Party. They have been to conferences where they join hands with state-supported Russian nationalists and Western communists and European and American right-wing conservatives and also National Socialist neo-fascists in these conferences, put on by a Russian-funded front called the Anti-Globalization Movement, the AGM,
The
which has had
anti-globalization
conferences in
movement.
Russia. Yeah, which is kind of funny because the actual globalists, the global Western
Yeah.
corporations, actually are the biggest supporters of
Yeah.
engagement with Putin.
Yeah.
They're not the warmongers.
Oh
They're the
God.
ones that want to
Yeah.
shovel more technology. So
Yeah.
it's like this is another thing when they say, "Oh, the globalists, the neocons, they want war with Russia." Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
You know, it's really ridiculous, the whole thing of it. And the problem with the conspiracy theory, and this is where I'm with people like Jared Nyquist on this, they really don't go into the forces of history, the sociology, the economics, the political dynamics. I look at the global situation and the assault against the West as well as the United States from competing power centers that sometimes collaborate with each other and are at war with each other. So this notion, as you mentioned earlier, where you're quoting Alex Jones and the Birchers, they talk about this, especially Robert Welch discussed this, that there was this conspiracy above communism. Well, no, these quote insiders, these were monopoly capitalists, as Gary Allen has pointed out, and others. The reality is that they collaborate with each other for different reasons because they have something that each other
Mm-hmm.
needs. But the reality is the capitalists don't control the communists. In fact, the communists ultimately want to exterminate all the billionaires and the multimillionaires. You look at what happened in China, for example, in Mao. When Mao took over, there were many domestic capitalists that collaborated with Mao, that Mao implemented policies. They were known as the national capitalists or the patriotic capitalists. And they were, Mao agreed to break strikes, to control the workers, to give favorable conditions to them. But after the anti-rightist campaign by about the mid 1950s, they were all wiped out, only to be dusted off by
Yeah.
the 1980s and 1990s once their usefulness was needed again. And that's really how I look at the world struggle. The big capitalists, elements of them admire Bolshevism and National Socialism for creating a strong government, breaking worker strikes, for creating new societies and things of that nature. They have alleged markets and labor pools where they could either sell goods or they could exploit slave labor, knowingly that these countries are enemies and serial human rights violators and not caring because they're fundamentally sociopathic. When you have unchecked power where people are allowed to do whatever they want, whether it's under a national socialist or a communist dictatorship, or whether you have in America or Britain, plutocracy where you have groups of wealthy men and women dominating the government and they're not told, no, you can't do this, or held accountable for their behavior, for their at times bad behavior. That's what happens. That's why when you have unchecked power like this, either in the private sector, and Sohrab Ahmari has talked about this in his book Tyranny Incorporated, or you have the communists like what we talk about and Jeff Nyquist talk about, it ends up at the same
Yeah.
end result. And you have these competing power centers. It's not a conspiracy, it's much more complicated. So, what
Well,
are your thoughts about this notion of competing power centers?
well, people really need to figure out how and when communists, especially early communists, when they acquired spycraft, because the very early communist movement, it was powerless. They didn't have any money. They could not protect themselves against the authorities all over Europe because back in those days you had zero legal protection. I mean, you couldn't get a lawyer and shut up, and you couldn't, protect your family and stuff. So it was fairly easy for the authorities to crack down on socialist movements, and of course, even before that. the core idea of socialism just simply came out of the reaction against serfdom. Because if you were a serf, you were not a full slave, but it was awfully close. You had to work and work and work. You had to serve in the military when there was a war, and you couldn't change anything about the situation. And you were under surveillance too. And so, obviously, in that situation, the average person in Europe, and roughly 90% of people here, were serfs. So, if I go back, if I took the time to track my family or my wife's family, if I track them down multiple generations, I mean, 90% of them were serfs. And so, from a serf's perspective, of course, it sounded like an idea to get the aristocrats out of power, redistribute the land, and redistribute the wealth of these aristocrats, and then try to have a new system. Now, of course, it's just a simple answer to create a socialist system where nobody really owns much, and you have these these officials deciding everything. That's a whole nother ballgame. But the core idea of socialism was just to get rid of serfdom, and you had sort of a competition between, a socialist rebellion or an Enlightenment rebellion. But how did early communists acquire spycraft? Now, the truthers would say, well, they got it from the Jews, or the communists were the Jews. You had so many people all over Europe who got into contact with socialist ideas, people who were not Jews, because there were not many Jews around in total. And so if you look really close, you can find that, for example, the British Empire, especially during the 1800s, the British, they wanted to destabilize France, their enemy. And they also wanted to destabilize parts of Germany, because Germany was not a unified empire. It was kind of a patchwork of different areas. And some of these areas were actually tied, because of these aristocratic families, tied to Britain. So in order to destabilize these competing empires, Britain used spy networks and propaganda, and part of this propaganda was Enlightenment. So, for example, you had the infamous Bavarian Order of the Illuminati. Now, the most powerful members of the Illuminati were German aristocrats, Braunschweig, these sort of families that were tied to Britain, actually. So it's likely, and there's some new research out of Austria that basically confirms what I've figured out. So the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati was just a British front organization. It was a British spy vehicle, and so one aspect of this strategy was Enlightenment, and the other part was socialist propaganda. And this is when, in France, in the early 1800s, this is when the French socialists started to put out these very successful books that were mainly directed, of course, against capitalism, which was becoming a thing in France. But these books created modern anti-Semitism. Before that, it was all garbage. It was all garbage about satanic rituals and killing children and all that nonsense. But then it became sort of this pseudoscience about this Jewish secret group that was taking over everywhere. And so this is how the French socialists could bypass, to a degree, the censorship laws in France, because it was easier to attack Jews than to attack the authorities. And by saying capitalism is greed, capitalism will collapse and will just cause bad things, by tying this to anti-Semitism, it was an easier sales pitch. And so there is a British link to these early French socialists, right? And then, of course, when the German right wing, started to copy the old French stuff about Jewish conspiracies, you can also find British intelligence, aristocratic intelligence involved. So this was created destabilize countries, to make people angry, to say capitalism per se is like vampires, blood-sucking, parasitic, and that means Jewish, right? This was the sales pitch, but it kind of took on a life of its own. Anti-Semitism. It became really, really large and really big. And when the Germans had adopted it, and also the Austrians, this is then in the 20th century with the Nazis, for example, still it could be used by Britain. It could be exploited by Britain. And this is when the British Empire, especially with Winston Churchill, when the Brits pretended to be very anti-Semitic and pro-fascist. Now, this was a deception maneuver, and historians have figured that out. But this deception to placate the Nazis and have them go east, this deception could only really work because of decades and decades prior of this anti-Semitic nonsense, right? If you want to play friendly with the Nazis and they believe all this stuff, you can make this work, because the story is the Rothschilds, this tiny, very, very tiny family. They took over Britain, basically dethroning the aristocracy in Britain. That was the mythology. And so that's why the British aristocracy during the Nazi era, that's why they could pretend to be friendly with the Nazis, because, hey, we're going to put the Jews out of power in Britain, and the Nazis could help with that. So people have to be aware how this was created and how this was used by the Nazis, and now it's used by the Russians. And so when Hitler was around, this was basically the first time in history when anti-Semitic conspiracy buffs thought this was it. This is the big historic chance of defeating evil. So this was when Hitler was around, and now it's Putin basically playing the same role. So conspiracy buffs worldwide believe they have a hero in Putin who's going to save them from the Jews, and to a lesser degree, in the minds of the conspiracy crowd, to a lesser degree, Donald Trump played that role, even though Donald Trump is a Zionist, and Donald Trump I don't think Donald Trump is anti-Semitic, but some people believe Trump will save them from the Jewish conspiracy. And I think never in history did you have two heads of state, a couple of years ago, two heads of state, Trump and Putin, sort of fanning the fantasies of the truthers. Because imagine to an American conspiracy buff, this is the historic chance. This is a chance that might never happen again in history. So I think this is why fans of Tucker Carlson, some fans of Jones, why they will put everything on the line, because they think this is the last chance they ever get. And once this chance is done, they can't achieve anything. So I think this is sort of the danger that we live in those times.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a number of good points. Where the Russians had learned, or I should say the Bolsheviks learned in part their spycraft, was from the old Tsarist Okhrana, to the point where the Bolsheviks and the Cheka incorporated elements of the Okhrana into their secret police and intelligence services. And the Okhrana they were effective. They created actually fake opposition groups, including the trade union movement of Father Capone, GAPON, look that up, Agent Zev, and others. So they were masters of provocateurs, and they absorbed that Tsarist intelligence tradecraft. And of course, the Tsars were linked, depending on which Tsar and aristocratic family we're talking about, were linked in to the German dynasties, particularly Nicholas II. So yes, there is that very real tie-in with the British aristocracy. Elements of the British aristocracy absolutely were pro-national socialist. The gentleman who was supposed to be king, in the 1930s, the Duke of Windsor.
Edward VIII or something, was it? Yeah.
Yeah, he was pro-national socialist. I looked on the database of the Times of London. where they had wide coverage of the Duke of Windsor in the 1930s, making visits to Germany, National Socialist Germany, and admiring, the German factory setups and the way labor was treated in Germany. And they had meetings with Robert Ley, who was a serial corrupt maniac, who was also a drunkard. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labor Front. Um, and everything else. So yeah, there was definitely this aristocratic um, elements of the aristocracy, British aristocracy, collaborating with Hitler, whether for whatever reason. So there's definitely this lineage, and that is an important part of the historical record that needs to be discussed. That was something I learned, of course, when I majored in history and political science. So a lot of what you were saying was ringing a bell, like, oh, yeah, he's right. I remember that from my history classes, my advanced history classes I took in undergraduate school. Now, concerning your earlier comment about the socialists being a reaction against the very real exploitation within unchecked capitalism, and that does concern me. And we have to admit that's true. And one of the things, I know I'm going to upset a lot of your listeners and even allies of mine when I say this, but when you look at the anti capitalist critiques provided, we have to, in order to save capitalism and preserve it, which is to me a very critical goal, capitalism as well as free forms of government. You have to tell the truths about the defects, the very real defects of the systems, and say, okay, Mr. Marxist or Mr. Fascist, you're right on aspects of these critiques, but we want to outflank you and beat you into the
Mm,
ground by perfecting the system better. And the problem is you have people, particularly on the free market side, even people on our side, who don't think strategically. They think, okay, my ideology is right. You got to privatize, you got to
yeah.
deregulate further at all costs and everything else, and we're going to get the perfect world. It's just like the communists saying we got to confiscate all the means of production and ban private property and all the rest of it, and we're going to have the perfect classless utopia as envisioned by Marx and his successors. Both are equally wrong, but in order to be effective anti communists, we can't just be licking the boots of billionaires and
Yeah.
multimillionaires and saying they produce jobs and everything else. Because in some
Yeah.
cases that's true, in
There's
other
a
cases that's not true.
there's
Now
a
I want
new
to read.
oh before I forget this
Uh,
point before I
yeah,
forget this
and
point,
I want you.
there's a
Go
there's
ahead. Go
a
ahead.
new there's a new generational conflict now underway where the current generation, like the 20-year-olds entering the job market or going to college, they are incredibly frustrated by the change in conditions. So they look at the previous generations, and they were able to go to work every day, pay off student loans and have a job and work regular hours and afford a house. And but nowadays, it seems out of reach for many. They say to get a decent degree, you have to spend tens of thousands of dollars and pay that back, and then you can't get a good job and you can't afford a house because a house is now way more expensive than it used to be. So I think this is kind of the point that you just mentioned, where the hardcore libertarians, they will say, just tough it out. You just find a job and you just suffer for a while, and somehow you're gonna make it work, and in the end you can accumulate wealth and put money into an ETF fund, and I don't know, it's gonna work out for you if you stick with capitalism. But the current generation doesn't have that perspective. They believe it's physically impossible to live in a decent way. And of course, communists are exploiting this to no end because they say the whole system can never work, even though it obviously can, because it has worked in the past. And of course, you can make it even better. Yeah, that's just
Mhm.
kind of this current generational conflict. And of
Yeah.
course, nobody wants to be exploited. If you don't have a perspective, this is frustrating, and you cannot fix this with libertarian slogans.
Right, and the problem is conservatism is dominated by libertarian economic ideology, and when you look at actually what libertarians say, they actually exhibit class prejudice, and we can go into that in a moment. But tying this in with the Tucker Carlson interview and later his trip to the Moscow subway, to a Russian supermarket, and where he says this month, coming to a Russian grocery store, the heart of evil, and seeing what things cost and how they live, it will radicalize you against our leaders. That's how I feel anyway, radicalized. We're not making any of this up, by the way, at all. And he said that's when you start to realize that ideology doesn't matter as much as you thought. If you
Yeah.
take people's standard of living and you tank it through filth and crime and inflation, and they literally can't buy the groceries they want, at that point, maybe it matters less what you say or whether you're a good person or a bad person. You're wrecking people's lives in their country, and that's what our leaders have done to us. Now, we got to take the hard pill and the hard medicine, and this is going to upset a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, the more libertarian elements and the Reaganomics crowd. But Tucker is not wrong. And this is where I posted on my Twitter, and this is my position on that. He's technically not wrong, but it's disturbing. And I say pay close attention. Just like the Cold War and the Great Depression, authoritarian states are competing for the hearts and souls of the citizens of the free world. Meanwhile, many of our leaders and investors and big corporate executives are driving down wages, impairing the quality of life,
Yeah.
like work-life balance and the cost of living. Capitalism is slowly self-destructing, and the totalitarians promising a better world are radicalizing even conservatives. We are doing this to ourselves. Putin and Xi Jinping is not the answer. Time for a new deal. And that's really what's called for here, because what's going on with Tucker, and the Russians are just lapping this up. They're the policymakers. They are loving the fact now that they are pushing conservatives against capitalism overall, radicalizing them, moving them towards the left and everything. And everybody on our side are like all upset at that. Oh my God, he's a traitor. And they're right about that, but they're forgetting the other part of the equation, that he is telling a hard truth, a hard reality that has been going on for over 40 years, since at least the early 1980s, where you have, and in Britain since 1979, you have the deindustrialization, you have the decline of the standard of living and the hyper financialization of the economy, as we talked about. So the Russians are seeing this, the Chinese are seeing this. It's called accelerationism, according to some Marxism, that the contradictions within an unchecked capitalism is slowly causing the system to explode. And where I part company with the hard left, with the Putinistas and the Chinese Communist Party allies in the West, is they're not the answer either, because that's tyranny and concentration camps. So to your audience, ladies and gentlemen, that's why I'm politically homeless. For those of you who don't know my work, this is why, in a nutshell, I'm politically homeless.
Well,
I have no one.
I tell people this: when you lived in Soviet Eastern Germany, there was one ideology on the menu. Okay, so this was indoctrinated into you from childhood on, and this was ironically basically adapted from the older systems, right? Because people always marketed communism to be new, but ultimately communism was just another Roman-style empire, but not with aristocratic dynasties. Instead, you had a political party, but which is kind of what Hitler tried with National Socialism. Hitler was a great fan of the Roman Empire. He was not such a big fan of the Germanic traditions, actually, because people oftentimes confuse that. Hitler was a fan of Rome, but he didn't believe in these hereditary aristocracies. He thought they were weak and he thought they messed it all up. He wanted a new Roman system with a political party. And so communists kind of did the same thing, because what's a Roman Empire? In essence, you have a territory that you completely control, and you try to expand by any means necessary. Sometimes it's war, sometimes it's something else. And so there was, back in the Roman Empire, there was basically one ideology on the menu, but many religions. You could pick your religion, mystery cult, whatever. But there was one ideology on the menu, which was the structure of the Roman Empire. So in a communist country like Soviet East Germany, there's one thing on the menu, and if you don't like it, you get into trouble. Now, that is not a clever type system because it just doesn't fit many people, right? Because some people they like individual entrepreneurship. They like to have make their own decisions. Some people are more conservative, and it's just it doesn't fit with many people. But when you have, let's say, when you have a modern republic, there's always kind of a danger that you get a predetermined menu, so to say. And I think this is something that happened in America over time, where you have some powerful people, some powerful circles in the United States who don't like a republic. They like the old, British ways or the Roman ways. But what they did was not offer one thing on the menu and force it on everybody, but they have a menu of like 5 major ideologies and sub-ideologies. So you can be on the left, center, right, libertarian, or conspiracy mythology, which is not a full ideology, but, sort of. And so you get this artificial choice, and you are expected to pick one of those, but you're still caught inside of that system. And that's why I also do not like the existing ideologies. I like bits and pieces of this, and I like bits and pieces of that, but I do not want a predetermined fake menu to be presented to me, because ultimately you're trapped either way. Because none of these ideologies are strong enough to completely take over. So no matter how much activism you do as a conservative or a libertarian, you can never really convince everybody to be the same way, because sometimes people are just different, right? Because the psychometrics people figured that out a long time ago. The communists figured that out a long time ago. Communists, they acquired psychological knowledge as early as the 1850s in Germany. Many people don't know that how old psychology actually is, and they understood, for example, psychometrics, where you can measure somebody's personality. That's where the communists understood what they call the authoritarian personality. They could measure somebody's attributes and determine how much of an authoritarian personality that is. So the communists knew who was an enemy, and the communists knew what kind of person could become a communist. And so when you have people that don't like new things, when you have people that are more risk aware, they don't like to experiment, right? Sometimes this is hard coded in your genetics, right? So yes. you cannot really force that person to become something completely different. You have to go against the nature of that person. And that's why a free republic is so important, where you have sort of a framework, but within that framework, you can be who you are. It's just the modern ideologies, I think, are designed according to psychometrics or psychology, because if you like new things, if you are very loose and free with your sexuality, if you're not so concerned with risk, then you are more likely to end up with the left. But if you're different, you may end up a conservative, or you're different, you may end up a libertarian, right? So by understanding the psychology, I think that's how, powerful circles, that's how they could try to control these ideologies and play people against each other. Now, in a republic, you're supposed to have a healthy competition of ideas and lifestyles, right? It's a constructive competition. But what this has turned into in the West is just divide and conquer. All these people doing this activism against each other, effectively canceling each other out, right? So you can just do the same activism forever and you will never actually attain your goal of making the society exactly the way you want it to be, forcing everybody to be like yourself. And historically, I think the origin of modern ideologies, that just happened by, not by accident, but just, it was just convenient. Because if you remember, ending serfdom, and serfdom didn't end on one day in Europe. It was in the 1700s in some places, it was in the 1800s in other places. Some people from the old system, some people, they were privileged, very privileged, so they had much to lose from change. So they became the conservatives. Then you had people who had something to lose, something to gain. Those became like the Enlightenment political middle. And then you had the poor people, they had nothing to lose, and they sort of became the left. They were more inclined to take risks and have a completely new system with no great ownership of any kind. And so this just happened that way. And I think that powerful circles, especially the aristocracy, the British, and then some Americans, they understood that, how these ideologies basically formed themselves or were formed by this change. And by using psychology, you could actually try to control these ideologies. And I think that any professional has to fully understand all of these ideologies, and every professional has to be able to mentally put yourself in the position of somebody from another ideology. You know, as you said, you have to imagine if you're a poor worker, or you have 3 jobs and you can't pay your bills with 3 jobs. Try to put yourself in that position, but also if you are poor, try to put yourself in the position of somebody who's, making his own thing and just working hard and creating something for himself. You can't just steal from somebody like that.
Exactly. And that's the thing. And that's one of the things I would like to see taught in schools is actual how an economy functions from the position of the entrepreneur as well as the employee. Because you're right. One of the items that really just doesn't make sense with anti-capitalist radicalism is because you're exactly right. You have people that are hardwired to be entrepreneurs, to create a new product, a new service, to legitimately invest in properties, become a landlord, or some other investor in stocks and whatnot, create a new bank. I'm not against all that stuff, because you're right, people are hardwired. People in my family, my girlfriend, who's physical therapy assistant, but also as a landlord, real estate investor herself, and a good one and an ethical one and very ambitious one. And that should be respected and admired, because you are taking a risk, especially if you come from somewhat limited means, but you're putting much on the line with your finances and your time. And that needs to be appreciated and encouraged, because this is one of the areas where I do agree with Ludwig von Mises, who said it best, in essence, that capitalism does create, where capitalism works in many areas of the economy and society, it does create a sense of accountability and meritocracy. It does, at least in its basic sense. But on the other hand, you have people that are not hardwired to be entrepreneurs and whatnot, but they might be intelligent in other fields. They might be intellectuals. They might not be intellectuals. They might be frontline workers. And, they, in my opinion, in order for the economy to function, and I'm more of a demand side believer in the economy, that it stems from demand, the amount of money people have, job security and whatnot, and that feeds production and it feeds the supply, if you will. And when you have workers making a middle-class life, that means not only there are more consumers and more consumption in the economy, which stems more production, again, demand-side economics, you're also having the ability of people to have children, to have the work-life balance, to go exercise, and maybe they might have that brilliant entrepreneurial thing that the steel worker may have, and a brilliant idea. And instead of working 5 jobs to make ends meet, instead they can then spend their time, more free time, developing that new product and new innovation. But unfortunately, there are a lot of people that don't want to hear this on our side. They think, they believe in this old argument of pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. If I could do it, you can
Mm.
do it. But the reality is that I kind of like the works of he's a investor himself and an exponent more of my type of capitalism, a gentleman by the name of Nick Hanauer. And I look at the economy as more as an organism, as an organic whole. Everybody is vital for the functioning of this organism. Like all of my organs, all the muscular system, the circulatory system, the nervous system, they all work theoretically in tandem with each other, or should be. And you keep your body healthy as you should in order for that functioning. The same really applies with the economy, where you have everyone's important: the investor, the consumer, the employee, the entrepreneur, the government, etc. They all should be working in harmony with each other, where no one part of that organism should be dominant to the detriment of another part of that economic organism. And if more conservatives believed in this, I think we could sincerely beat back the appeal of neo-fascism and socialism and communism here in the United States. And furthermore, there are conservatives. You were talking about putting yourselves in the shoes of other people like the worker. Well, there are conservatives. Ben Shapiro, who I detest personally and professionally. He is awful. He said that having empathy in politics is actually a bad thing.
Oh
And
no.
this is a strain of, yeah, he does. He does. And then he kind of walks it back, but the point was made. And you have a lot of conservatives that it's not only about ideology, but I think there's, like the Marxists and neo-fascists, I think there's a malignance in elitist, an unfounded elitist malignance on their parts, where they just don't like ordinary people.
Yeah, this
There are a
became
lot,
like yeah, this was
Milton Friedman.
yeah,
Go ahead.
when this was like in the during the Obama administration, when I think the second Obama term, when the race in 2014, the race was between Obama and I think McCain. Was it McCain?
Yeah, in 2012, it was Mitt Romney
Uh,
and Obama.
yeah, exactly. It was Mitt Romney, Obama, and so when that happened, a lot of people I think became sort of disillusioned by this left-right Democrat-Republican system, and that frustration led to a boom of ultra-libertarian thought, at least for a while. But then Trump happened, and then everything turned out differently. But I remember that trend phase of radical libertarianism, and I noticed that even benign libertarians turn into radicals, and they became sort of religious about it, and people kept really pestering me. I'm supposed to read and promote Ayn Rand, and when I did reread Ayn Rand and I looked at how she created a cult movement around herself, I noticed sort of this, what you just described, sort of this anger and hatred towards the the masses. If you remember in that famous book that she wrote, what was it called? Atlas Shrugged, I think it was. It's about these
Yes.
hyper industrialist super people that withdraw from the general world, and they go to this secluded valley, and they watch how the rest of society breaks down, and they're gleeful about it, or they just accept it because they think the system has to break down. They take out their own expertise from the system, it breaks down, and then at some point they will reemerge victorious. And so you saw kind of this hatred against what some libertarians call the unproductive classes. And I noticed that some former Marxists turned into hyper libertarians, and they were preaching class warfare, but not in the style of Karl Marx. But they had a different version of it, where they differentiate between the productive classes and the unproductive classes, and they are at constant war with each other, according to these people. And so if you belong to the productive classes, you have to fight to the death against the unproductive classes. And so I thought, guys,
Yeah.
wait a minute, the world doesn't really work that way. And ultimately Ayn Rand started to glorify these, the robber barons, the Rockefellers, and the Vanderbilts, and to me, the story of the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers, to me, it wasn't so much focused on personal greed. It was more, to me, like an organized effort to make the United States, competitive for the future. So there was some secret coordination. It was meant to be as powerful as possible, and I think they cut some very significant corners and did some stuff that was not stuff that was not constitutional back then. But it's not a good idea to glorify that, especially if you don't understand the secret history of it. But that's what Ayn Rand and others have done. So these were the super people, the supermen, and everybody else can just frick off, and just not a healthy thing, because you just antagonize so many people instead of working with them. And of course, if you treat people that way, they will look for communism or trutherism as a way out of their predicament. So
I had a friend of mine, the late Kenny Stolman. He unfortunately committed suicide in January of 2021. He was an activist here in Florida with the Party of Communists USA, and he defected from the party. And then eventually we met online through common political Facebook groups that were kind of like, My Politics, which I call radical civic nationalism. And he had told me before he left the party, he recounted to me that he recruited 3 or 4 people based on the fact that when you listen to a number of libertarian and anti-union right-to-work types and so-called conservatives, he recruited predominantly amongst the university students and the unorganized working class here in Florida. And the party leadership in New York, Angelo, who was the head of the Party of Communists USA, he said that when it comes to the Republicans here and all over the country and the Ayn Rand types and the Tea Party types, that the propaganda writes itself, which means that we don't have to do any work in making capitalism look bad because it's already doing it to itself. Yeah. And my friend Kenny told me that he recruited 3 or 4 people before he defected quietly from the party and renounced communism. And it's a long story. And there's documented evidence to show what you're talking about when in a letter to Ayn Rand regarding her book, Atlas Shrugs, Ludwig von Mises, and this is really disappointing to read, wrote, "You have the courage to tell the masses what no politician told them, that you, meaning the masses, are inferior and all the improvements in your conditions, which you simply take for granted, you owe to the effort of men who are better than you. If this is to be arrogance, as some of your critics observe, it is still the truth that has to be said in this age of the welfare state." And again, Alex, I'm going to piss off a lot of your German listeners. I know some of them are libertarians and that love Ludwig von Mises, but I mean, the truth has to be told. In order to save the system, you have to tell some very hard truths.
Exactly.
More contemporary example, the speech to CEOs, Jordan Peterson, who all of us are very critical. He says that in a speech to CEOs, Jordan Peterson said, quote, "Since when do you care about what the stock boys think?" Well, excuse me, it's those same stock boys that help you get rich, just like you CEOs help build the company. Both have to work hand in hand together. Yeah. Both are critical for the functioning. So it's a reality. There's a malignance. It's like the former Afghan communist leader who said in 1979 that, "I don't care. Even if we have to kill half of the Afghan population, we're going to build communism and F it." This is the same malignance, in my opinion.
I recently did a longer report on Napoleon, and Napoleon came from a fairly normal background. I mean, he was not a real aristocrat by French, French definition of it. And so his father had tried desperately to raise the family status. They even forged some documents or bought some documents and had some forgeries made to fake proof that the family, went back couple of hundreds of years and was eligible for a real French title. And so when Napoleon, by hard work and expertise, when Napoleon was climbing the ranks, he was starting to judge the work of some of these aristocrats in the military and in government, and he thought that some of them were fairly competent, some of them were not competent. They thought almost anybody could do that job. And I think this is something that people need to understand when we're talking about, elites or whatever, because in European history, all over European history, you had the more competent types. Some of them were really competent and really devious, but a lot of them were just very, very average in what they did. And so you look at these castles, and some of the German nationalists, they will point at the grand buildings in Berlin or Dresden and all these other cities and say, okay, look at this great stuff that was made by these elite families, but they didn't build these things. It was real people that built these castles. It was real people that worked the fields day in, day out, raising their children, fighting in the wars. They made the grain that was basically money back then. They paid for all of this. So this is something that people tend to forget a lot of the times, that just everybody can play a very important role. And it's when you have when you look at some mafia types, some organized crime syndicates. Sometimes these people are not very competent, even though they can be very successful in their business, right? But it's just if you inherit the money, and if you inherit the spycraft, and you inherit all these existing networks, you can continue to do that. Some aristocrats became lazy. Some aristocrats became too incompetent. But there are some aristocratic lines that became more powerful over 1,000 years or even longer. So these are the types that then took over Britain. They took over British Empire. And this is a very large cluster of families, by the way. This is not just the people you see on television. It's actually pretty vast. I was surprised myself to figure out how large these families were. But sometimes powerful people you see are only placeholders. They have to play the part. But there's a network behind them. And this is why ideologies are not good enough, because ideologies were created and codified before modern science was fully developed, right? I mean, and these ideologies were developed oftentimes without modern psychology being part of it. And usually these ideologies do not teach you anything specific about spycraft either. So do you want to rely on an ideology that does not teach you spycraft, that does not teach you secret history of things, an ideology that is outdated and it doesn't even incorporate modern science and modern psychology, right? So I think that a republic, or the concept of a republic, has to be constantly modernized, like you have to modernize pretty much everything. And we're voting for people we do not know. We're voting for programs we do not understand, and we don't even know what networks these people belong to. And I think that once you have a broad understanding in the population about spycraft, I think this is how we can fix most of the problems. Because otherwise, we're just going in circles. We just try to fix problems with ideologies, and of course, these ideologies claim to understand evil, and they claim to be able to fix evil. But if you look at modern science about human evil versus these ideologies, it's vastly different, right? So for a communist, the root of all evil is the classic family, private ownership, so on and so forth. But if you take a conservative, the conservative thinks that the root of anything good is the family and ownership and tradition and religion. So these concepts are unscientific most of the time. They're not modern enough, and they contradict each other. So one person with one ideology has a completely different understanding of evil than another person from another ideology. And this is not how we fix human evil. I mean, we understand the brain a lot better. We understand psychology a lot better. But people still go off of these old ideologies. I mean, Karl Marx, when he was around, many sciences were not developed yet, and he couldn't handle people and he couldn't handle money. So why would we accept this guy as the prophet of an ideology that teaches us how to interact with each other, right?
Exactly. And Karl Marx was a malignant individual too as well.
Oh
He
yeah,
was an ardent anti-black racist. He was anti-Jewish. When you look at the program in the Communist Manifesto, he calls for the despotic inroads in private property. I mean, and he lists literally a program of action of his ideal communist state, of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as he termed it. And it's items that is highly, in my opinion, very malicious and against humanity itself and
yeah.
human nature. There's
But
no
also,
there's no question.
yeah, but also, I
Go
mean,
ahead.
Marx took his ideas mostly from earlier French socialists, but there was also a guy, I think his name was Clinton Roosevelt. Yeah, that Roosevelt family. And I think Clinton
Yes.
Roosevelt, he put out a text on socialism way earlier than Karl Marx. And that idea was meant for America. This was intended to be an original American brand socialism, because industrial capitalism was developing, and some people didn't know if they wanted to trust a republican capitalism. So they thought maybe we could organize everything with officials, but this idea was then shelved, and only many decades later did some Americans did they pull out this old idea, dusted it off, and this is when the Democratic Party became socialist. Because in the old days in America, the main political debate was how much of a republic can we be, or how much should we copy things from the old British Empire. So this was the original debate, but then it became, left versus right. Should we have socialism? And I think we need to go back to the old political debate of America. Just how much does security dictate certain things, and how much do we need to be a republic? Because if we go back to these medieval times, it's not pretty. And I think that many people nowadays are suffering because not because people are suffering not because of some Jewish conspiracy thing, but because of a very old European type system. It's this old European serfdom, and it has been around in Europe for a very long time, and it was adapted from the ancient world, so it's been around for thousands of years. So we do not want serfdom. We do not want communism, which is not too different from serfdom. And it's just, I mean, I'm almost running out of my time here because I have the weekly scheduled show with Jeff Nyquist coming up. And when you talk about modern serfdom, right? As we can feel that what we can feel today. People need to understand what we're talking about. And somebody like Jeff Nyquist is in his 60s. There should be thousands of people like Jeff Nyquist. And I'm sort of the next generation. I'm going to turn 40 in a few days. There should be thousands of people like me, and already there should be the next generation. There should be these 20-year-olds doing something like this. But we have one Jeff Nyquist, we have one Nevin Gussack. There's this one person like me, and there's others out there. But that needs to be a whole lot more, Because we see, like in 1991, anti-communism basically died. Professional anti-communism, which is counterintelligence, it really died, and you see this generational loss where you have somebody like Jeff Nyquist, who's now in his 60s, and then you have me, who's 40, and then you don't have the 20-year-olds who are already really good at this. It's just we lost 2 generations at least. So time is of the essence. There's a time pressure. People need to become really smart really fast.
Yeah, there's no question about it. The whole idea of anti-communism, dying, a lot of that had to do with the old, where we talked about earlier in the show, of the Gorbachev program and even Brezhnev and the Communist Party of Soviet Union with Tatantin, Perestroika, and Glasnost, and removing the enemy of the image. Now we're at a point where you have Gloria La Riva, who is an official with the Party of Socialism and Liberation, and she rather plausibly stated that, quote, the fog of anti-communism is lifting from the, quote, negativity and misunderstanding of the past to, quote, acceptance. You have Dustin Gustella, who's a writer for Jacobin magazine and a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, which is a Marxist group and basically essentially a communist group. He said that the millennials did not have the same fears of socialism and communism since they didn't grow up during the height of the Cold War. He said that they don't remember all this propaganda about the Soviet Union and communism and how evil it is. And I could read on different quotes by actual communist and Marxist leaders and activists where they're saying this. So people like us are viewed as archaic, old-fashioned. We're viewed as dinosaurs, and oh my God, you're cold warriors. And now you have to circle back on the first topic of discussion about Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones and others on the quote-unquote right that are promoting Vladimir Putin's Russia. Now our biggest opponents are people from allegedly in our own camp who should be really who historically have been aware of the threat of communism. And in some cases, in Jones actually initially was very concerned about the threat of Putin and Russia during the 1990s in alliance with China. And then all of a sudden he makes this big switch in 2008. So, yeah, people like Jeff Nyquist, and you. I mean, Jeff is a very erudite fellow. His work, The Origins of the Fourth World War, has changed some of my thinking on certain issues critically. There are issues where I disagree with Jeff, and we disagree politely but very firmly with each other. But the point being is that people like you and Jeff Nyquist and Trevor Loudon and others out there really have very solid scholarship and warnings that really should be more in the mainstream. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, really and truly, people like Jeff Nyquist, for example, should have Tucker Carlson's job. There's really no rhyme or reason whether I agree with him half the time, all the time, or none of the time. The guy is a smart guy. He's obviously had a lot of life experience. He's met a lot of defectors from the intelligence and military apparatus of the totalitarian bloc. He was basically, pardon my language, he was screwed or effed over by organized communism in the university system that denied him a position from academia. So he had to brush up with communist authoritarianism. This is a guy that should be on TV, should be discussing these issues and everything else, rather than somebody like a Tucker Carlson. I'm sorry, I'm probably going to offend your MAGA viewers now, but people like Jeff and Nyquist are far more historically literate. They're far more thoughtful. But unfortunately, what sells is not necessarily scholarship and truth. What sells is how you dress, playing to your crowd, to your voter base, rather than really just saying, okay, guys, here's the truth. And certainly somebody like me, I'm 49 years old. I sure as heck am not going to be on TV. You think the conservatives are going to want me? The so-called conservatives? No way, Jose. You think the communists want me? Well, on a Reddit forum, I was viewed as called an anti-communist crackpot who had good scholarship. That was the term they used for me, an anti-communist crackpot. amongst other things. So,
All right.
which is a badge of honor. I'm glad they're on to me. I'm sure they know who I am, anyways, at this point, and it is what it is. But yeah, this has been, I think, a very good show. I hope to have you on future shows. And did you have any concluding comments? Did you want to come back on future shows, or what are your
Well,
thoughts?
absolutely. I mean, I'm sitting on so much material that I've done for the German audience, and I've just been posting all this stuff for, let's say, half a year in English. So I mean, I've had an English channel, but I neglected this for a long time. But for the last 6 months, I've been constantly posting stuff and finding so many interesting people, finding people like yourself, and it's absolutely great. And so we can do a million shows, we can do any kind of topic, and I'm working on some interesting interviews, and yeah, this should be very exciting.
Yeah, great. No, you've been an excellent source. I really admire your work and your painstaking research. I particularly appreciated your segment that you did, your show, where what initially turned me on to your work, aside from the good words and the good shows that you and Jeff do, and your knowledge of the communist threat, and your family's involvement, I think, also with totalitarianism, and how you don't like that, you were soured on that from the get-go, and your appreciation for political and economic liberty. But the other part was your show you did. It was a short show where you really dissembled all the ideologies: communism, National Socialism,
Yeah.
libertarianism, the conspiracy theory crowd. And this told me, hey, Alex here is an independent thinker, where he might be a kindred spirit. And I think people like us kind of have to unify a bit and organize. And I would love to see truly alternative news media political group, but also a news empire where you have true independent thinkers that are not wedded to any particular one ideological religion or a particular economic interest group, where we are free thinkers whose goal is to preserve our countries against the encroachments of expansionist, militaristic totalitarianism as represented in Moscow and Beijing. And, I think you have an amazing knowledge. I'm going to want to pick your brain about German politics that I've had questions about for so many years doing research, like the curious case of Franz Josef Strauss, who was an anti-communist, who all of a sudden was the biggest proponents of
Mm-hmm.
loans to East Germany. Like, what the hell happened there, and how
Oh,
did he become all of a
The
sudden?
Stasi found some old files on him, or they had files on him. The Stasi suspected him of having collaborated with the OSS during the end of World War II. So they thought he gave away secrets of the air defense for a big city, and this belief was also shared by Western intelligence. They also found files on that, and so it was not just him who the Stasi had material on. It was also Helmut Kohl. They figured out his funny money, because one of his people actually worked for the Stasi. So they had material on many people, and so the usual response was to cut a deal with the East and to try to smooth things over. But how much smoothing was actually done is still not fully researched yet.
Yeah, it's amazing, because all of a sudden he became best buddies with Alexander Golakowski, who I'm
Golakowski.
sure you know. Yeah, and if you ever look at photos of him, for those in the audience, the American audience, and you look at pictures with assembled West German businessmen and CDU, CSU, and SPD politicians, and all the communists like Gunter Mittag and Golakowski and others, they just have this very, if you look at their faces, they just have this look to them that it's just like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like a cat catching all the mice and
Eerie,
whatnot.
very eerie. All right, I'm at the end of my time. This was absolutely great. Let's do that again very soon. And well, talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining the program. Take care.